David, do you think this change of Prime Minister will lead to a boost in Macron's popularity?
Well, I think it's a very delicate balancing act in any case, really, because, of course, Macron has now essentially, got rid of or encouraged to resign a very popular Prime Minister in Edouard Philippe. And I think whenever this happens historically under the Fifth French Republic, it's a very delicate balancing act for the president. On one hand, he has now potentially got the position to become more popular himself by placing someone who is essentially a sort of technocratic prime minister in Jean Castex in charge of the government. So in some ways, I think Macron would certainly hope that his own popularity would increase ahead of the 2022 presidential elections. But it's a very difficult balancing act, given the fact that this is a relatively unknown prime minister, likely to appoint some very technocratic ministers in charge of the economy in particular. So in some ways, it's very difficult to see how Macron can really boost his own popularity, given how Philippe was so popular and will, of course, go off and continue to be popular in his own fiefdom of Le Havre. So it's a very difficult challenge for Macron ahead, really. I think the key thing really is around the economy. If Castex and Macron together can work on boosting the French economy in the next few months, then obviously the chances of Macron being re-elected in 2022 increase massively. But he has likely made a very real enemy in Edouard Philippe, and that's certainly going to come back to haunt him in the future.
And certainly this new cabinet will be facing extraordinary difficulties, given we're now confronting the worst economic recession seen since the end of World War II.
A very real challenge across Europe and, of course, the developed world really as well, and indeed the developing world around the economy. I think really Castex in particular needs to now think about trying to expand the offering in terms of the state support for industry, as you were talking about previously, particularly for some of those really struggling industries in aerospace in particular. We know that Airbus is really struggling financially, given the low sort of demand for flights at the moment. So there's a real demand, I think, in terms of putting state support there for industry in particular, and indeed potentially for the tourist industry, given concerns around travelling this summer with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think really two things, really focusing on industry and focusing on tourism, and indeed the hospitality sector as a whole. I think those are real areas where both Macron and Castex can make a real difference, and they can indeed boost their own popularity in comparison to other comparable leaders, particularly the likes of Boris Johnson in the UK and Donald Trump in the USA.
Coming back to what you were saying earlier about Edouard Philippe's resignation and the fact it may come back to haunt President Macron, do you think there's a chance that Edouard Philippe is now eyeing those presidential elections 2 years from now and thinking about himself being a presidential candidate?
I think that's highly likely. This is a man who's had, real political experience at the Matignon over the last few years. Somebody who came from the centre-right and positioned himself as a centrist. He can really do that again in 2 years' time. I think crucially, Macron was somebody who didn't really have a strong party following when he came to office in 2017. He positioned himself as an outsider. He can't do that again in 2022 because he's currently the incumbent of the Élysée Palace as the president. So really, Philippe has this sort of sense of 2 years to go away, positioning himself as an outsider, having said, I was essentially sacked from the government. I've not been in government for the last 2 years by the time we get to 2022. And he will think certainly about challenging for the presidency. The centre-right Republican Party is more or less in disarray. We know, of course, that François Fillon, its candidate at the last presidential election, was recently found guilty of fraud or corruption, effectively. We know he's challenging that and appealing that decision, but that places the centre-right in a very difficult position. So they may well be looking to Philippe to form allegiances there to a sort of centre-right coalition to challenge Macron in 2022. And let's not forget, of course, that the real opposition in France also comes from the far-right Rassemblement National party with Marine Le Pen, and she'll certainly be looking to challenge Macron again for the presidency. So at this point, it's very difficult to predict. And of course, 2017, threw up all kinds of challenges. What we could be looking at is a really clear three-horse race between Macron, Philippe and Le Pen in 2022.
David Lees, thank you so much for that.